Agent Sarah Chen closed her eyes for a moment as she settled into seat 3C. The past week had been exhausting. 3 cities in 5 days tracking a complex money laundering operation. Now she was on the final leg home, a 4-hour flight from Chicago to San Francisco, where she would report to the FBI field office tomorrow morning. At 34, Sarah had built a solid reputation within the Bureau for her meticulous attention to detail and calm demeanor under pressure. Her dark navy pantsuit was crisp despite the long day, her FBI credentials tucked neatly in her inner pocket. She kept her hair in a practical shoulder-length cut that framed her face. "Ticket, please." The voice came sharp and unexpected. Sarah opened her eyes to see a flight attendant standing in the aisle, looking down at her with an expression that seemed oddly disapproving. The woman's name tag read Rebecca Winters. "Good afternoon," Sarah said with a polite smile, reaching for her boarding pass in her bag. "Here you go." Rebecca took the boarding pass, examined it with exaggerated scrutiny, and then looked back at Sarah. "This is business class," she stated flatly. "Yes, I'm aware," Sarah replied evenly. The Bureau had booked her business class due to the length of the flight and her immediate reporting requirements upon landing. Rebecca's eyes narrowed slightly. "Are you sure you're in the right section?" A passenger across the aisle glanced over, then quickly looked away, seeming uncomfortable. "Yes, seat 3C. It's right here on my boarding pass," Sarah explained, pointing to the clear information. Rebecca handed the boarding pass back without another word and continued down the aisle, where she greeted the next passenger, an older white man in a suit, with a warm smile. Sarah took a deep breath. She was used to microaggressions in her line of work. As one of the few Asian American women in her division, she learned long ago to pick her battles carefully. She pulled out her phone to check her emails one last time before takeoff. 20 minutes later, as passengers continued to board, Sarah noticed that Rebecca had returned to the business class cabin and was offering pre-flight drinks to several passengers. When their eyes met, Rebecca quickly looked away and moved to help another passenger. Sarah watched as Rebecca cheerfully served everyone in the first few rows except her. When Rebecca passed by her seat for the third time without acknowledgement, Sarah gently pressed the call button. Rebecca approached, her smile vanishing. "Yes," she asked curtly. "Could I please have some water?" Sarah asked. "We're still boarding," Rebecca replied. "I'll get to it later." 2 minutes later, Sarah observed as Rebecca handed a glass of champagne to the man across the aisle who hadn't even requested it. The passenger, a kind-faced man in his 60s, seemed to notice the situation. He caught Sarah's eye and gave her a small, apologetic smile. As the final boarding announcements came, Sarah pulled out her phone again, this time opening her notes app. She began documenting times, actions, and specific phrases. Her FBI training had taught her the importance of contemporaneous notes. Another flight attendant passed through the cabin, checking seat belts and overhead bins. She smiled warmly at Sarah, creating a stark contrast to Rebecca's behavior. Sarah didn't want to create a scene, but she also recognized what was happening. With 12 years at the Bureau, she'd learned to trust her instincts. Something about this situation felt wrong, targeted, and it was only just beginning. The large aircraft pushed back from the gate, engines humming to life. Sarah Chen tucked her notebook away and settled back in her seat, hoping the unpleasant start to her journey was just a misunderstanding. She had faced enough challenges in her career without adding airline drama to the list. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared for takeoff. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin." The captain's voice crackled through the speakers. Sarah watched as Rebecca Winters moved through the business class cabin with practiced efficiency, checking seat belts and stowing items. When she reached Sarah's row, her demeanor changed visibly. "Your bag needs to go completely under the seat," Rebecca said sharply, pointing to Sarah's small leather briefcase that was already tucked away. "It is under the seat," Sarah replied calmly, gesturing to show that the bag was properly stowed. Rebecca leaned in closer, her voice low but harsh. "I don't appreciate your attitude." Sarah blinked, genuinely surprised. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand what you mean." "I haven't." "Just make sure you follow all instructions during this flight." Rebecca cut her off before moving to the next row, where she smiled pleasantly at other passengers. The man across the aisle raised his eyebrows slightly, clearly having overheard the exchange. He looked at Sarah and mouthed, Are you okay? Sarah gave a small nod, though she felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. The kind that came when she recognized discrimination happening, but had to carefully calculate her response. As the plane climbed to cruising altitude, Sarah pulled out the novel she'd been trying to finish for weeks. Her work rarely left time for reading, and she'd been looking forward to these few uninterrupted hours in the air. 30 minutes into the flight, the meal service began. Rebecca worked her way through the cabin, laying white cloths on tray tables and taking drink orders. "What would you like to drink, sir?" she asked the businessman sitting beside Sarah with a warm smile. "Just water, thanks," he replied. Rebecca nodded pleasantly, then proceeded to ask the passenger across the aisle for his selection, completely skipping over Sarah. "Excuse me," Sarah said politely. "Could I order a drink as well?" Rebecca turned to her with a cold stare. "I'm getting to everyone. You'll need to be patient." The businessman next to Sarah frowned slightly. "But you just asked me and skipped." "Sir, I'm handling the service," Rebecca interrupted firmly. Sarah pulled out her phone and discreetly added to her notes. 2 rows ahead, a woman with curly hair turned around, clearly having noticed the exchange. She gave Sarah a sympathetic look. When the meal trays came, Sarah noticed hers was the last to arrive. When she opened her napkin, there were no utensils. "Excuse me, I don't have any silverware," Sarah said when Rebecca passed by again. Rebecca sighed loudly. "You people are never satisfied, are you?" she muttered, just loud enough for several nearby passengers to hear. The cabin grew uncomfortably quiet. A woman across the aisle looked shocked. The businessman beside Sarah set down his fork. "What do you mean by you people?" he asked Rebecca directly. "I'm just trying to do my job," Rebecca snapped, dropping a sealed plastic utensil pack onto Sarah's tray before walking away quickly. Sarah felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment and frustration. As an FBI agent, she was trained to de-escalate situations, not create them. But she was also trained to recognize when someone was being singled out unfairly. She looked around and realized several passengers were now watching the situation unfold. A young woman 2 rows back had her phone tilted in a way that suggested she might be recording. Sarah took a deep breath and carefully documented this latest exchange in her notes. This wasn't just poor service anymore. The pattern was becoming clear, and the tension in the cabin was building with each interaction. Halfway through the flight, Sarah Chen felt increasingly uncomfortable. She had barely touched her meal, her appetite diminished by the growing tension. The cabin had settled into an uneasy quiet, with several passengers occasionally glancing her way with concerned expressions. Sarah needed to use the restroom but hesitated, knowing she would have to interact with Rebecca again. Finally, she unbuckled her seatbelt and made her way to the front of the business class cabin. As she approached, Rebecca was chatting with another flight attendant. When she spotted Sarah, her smile vanished. "The bathroom is occupied," Rebecca said curtly, even though the indicator clearly showed it was available. "The light shows it's vacant," Sarah pointed out calmly. Rebecca stepped directly in front of the door. "I just told you it's occupied. You'll have to wait." At that moment, the other flight attendant, a younger woman named Lisa according to her name tag, looked confused. "I think it's actually free, Rebecca," she said quietly. Before Rebecca could respond, the bathroom door opened, revealing an empty restroom. No one had been inside. "Excuse me," Sarah said politely, moving past Rebecca to enter the bathroom. When Sarah returned to her seat a few minutes later, she found her tray table had been cleared, including her half-full water glass and the book she'd left on the seat. Her seat back had also been pushed into the upright position, though the flight was still at cruising altitude and every other passenger still had their seats reclined. "Where's my book?" Sarah asked Rebecca, who was passing by with a trash bag. "I don't know what you're talking about," Rebecca replied loudly. "Please don't make accusations against the crew." Several passengers were now openly watching the interaction. The businessman next to Sarah spoke up. "She just asked about her book," he said. "It was right here a few minutes ago." "Sir, please stay out of this," Rebecca snapped. Then, turning to Sarah with a cold stare, she added, "If you continue to create disturbances, I'll have to inform the captain." Sarah took a deep breath, her FBI training kicking in. She needed to defuse this situation, but she also needed to be clear that the behavior was unacceptable. "I'm not creating a disturbance," Sarah said evenly. I'd like to speak with the lead flight attendant, please. I am the lead on this section, Rebecca replied, her voice rising. And you're being threatening. I'm not threatening anyone, Sarah responded, keeping her voice calm and steady. I'm simply requesting professional service. Rebecca's face flushed with anger. Are you accusing me of something? By now, the confrontation had drawn attention from throughout the business cabin. A middle-aged woman across the aisle had her phone out, clearly recording the interaction. I believe I'm being discriminated against, Sarah said firmly. And I'd like to speak with the captain or another supervisor. Discriminated against? Rebecca scoffed loudly. That's ridiculous. Sarah reached into her jacket and pulled out her FBI credentials. My name is Special Agent Sarah Chen with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I am formally requesting to speak with the captain about this situation. A hushed silence fell over the cabin. Rebecca's eyes widened at the sight of the badge, but her expression quickly hardened again. You're threatening a flight attendant with your government position. That's a federal offense, Rebecca declared loudly, backing away as if Sarah had physically threatened her. I'm not threatening anyone, Sarah clarified calmly. I'm identifying myself as a federal agent who is requesting to speak with the captain about discriminatory treatment. Rebecca turned abruptly and hurried toward the cockpit, speaking rapidly into her crew phone. Captain, we have an unruly passenger claiming to be FBI. She's making threats and disrupting the flight. I don't feel safe. The passengers around Sarah looked shocked at this blatant misrepresentation. The woman who had been recording spoke up. That's absolutely not what happened, she said. I have the whole thing on video. Sarah felt a mixture of frustration and grim determination. After years in the FBI, she knew what was coming next. The seatbelt sign pinged on suddenly. Sarah Chen felt the aircraft begin a gentle turn as the captain's voice came over the speaker system. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'll be making an unscheduled return to O'Hare International Airport due to an onboard situation. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We'll be on the ground in approximately 20 minutes. A wave of murmurs swept through the cabin. Several passengers looked at Sarah with confusion, while others glared at Rebecca, who stood at the front of the cabin with her arms crossed, looking triumphant. The businessman beside Sarah shook his head in disbelief. This is outrageous, he said. You've done nothing wrong. I need everyone to see this, announced the woman who had been recording. She had stood up despite the seatbelt sign. I got the whole thing on video. This flight attendant is lying about what happened. Lisa, the younger flight attendant, approached Sarah with an apologetic expression. The captain has asked that you speak with him once we land, she said quietly. I'm sorry about this situation. Sarah nodded, maintaining her professional composure despite feeling a mix of anger and humiliation. She reached for her phone to send a quick message to her supervisor, explaining the situation and that she might be delayed. As the plane descended, more passengers began speaking up. I saw everything, said an elderly woman a few rows back. This young lady did nothing wrong. This is clear discrimination, added another passenger. I'm a lawyer, and I'll be happy to provide a statement. Rebecca paced at the front of the cabin, occasionally whispering to another crew member and pointing at Sarah. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. Where there had been uncomfortable silence before, there was now obvious support for Sarah and growing anger toward the flight attendant. The plane touched down smoothly and taxied to a gate. 2 airport police officers and the airline's ground supervisor boarded as soon as the doors opened. We need to speak with an unruly passenger, the ground supervisor announced, looking around the cabin. Rebecca immediately pointed at Sarah. That's her. She's been threatening me and disrupting the flight. She claims to be FBI, but I don't believe her. Sarah stood calmly, her FBI credentials in hand. Special Agent Sarah Chen, Chicago Field Office, she said, showing her badge to the officers. The police officers looked surprised, clearly not expecting to confront an actual federal agent. The ground supervisor checked her identification carefully. She hasn't done anything wrong, the businessman beside Sarah insisted. I've been sitting next to her the entire flight. The flight attendant has been targeting her from the beginning. We have video evidence, added the woman who had been recording. Several other passengers nodded in agreement, some holding up their phones. Despite the rising chorus of support, The ground supervisor looked uncomfortable. Agent Chen, we still need you to deplane while we sort this out. It's standard procedure. Sarah understood the protocol. No matter how unjust, an aircraft commander's authority was nearly absolute, and she knew making a scene would only complicate matters. I understand, she replied professionally. I'll comply, but I want it on record that I'm filing formal complaints with the airline, the FAA, and the Department of Transportation for discriminatory treatment. As Sarah gathered her belongings to leave the aircraft, passengers began to voice their objections. This is wrong. We're not leaving without her. Check the videos first. Sarah turned to address the cabin. Thank you all for your support, but please don't disrupt your travel plans on my account. The truth will come out through proper channels. As she walked toward the exit, her head held high, Sarah heard the unmistakable sounds of multiple phones recording. She knew this wasn't just about her anymore, it had become something bigger. The last thing she saw before stepping off the plane was Rebecca's face, no longer triumphant but uncertain, as passengers continued to hold up their phones, capturing every moment of the unjust removal. By 9:30 the next morning, Sarah Chen sat in the office of Assistant Director Marcus Jennings at the FBI Chicago field office. The events of yesterday's flight had moved with unexpected speed through both social media and official channels. The videos are everywhere, Jennings said, turning his laptop screen to show Sarah. The footage showed her calm demeanor contrasted with Rebecca's aggressive behavior. One clip had already reached 2 million views on TikTok with the caption, "Racist flight attendant gets FBI agent kicked off flight for absolutely nothing." Sarah sighed. This isn't how I wanted to spend my week. I understand, Jennings replied, but the Bureau stands behind you. What happened was unacceptable. He pushed a folder across his desk. We've already received statements from 12 passengers who witnessed the incident. They reached out proactively. Sarah opened the folder, scanning the first statement from the businessman who had sat beside her. His detailed account matched her memory exactly. The airline CEO called this morning, Jennings continued. They've launched a formal investigation and want your cooperation. Of course, Sarah nodded. Though exhausted, she was determined to see this through, not just for herself, but for anyone who might face similar treatment. Outside the office, Sarah's phone buzzed with notifications. News outlets were requesting interviews, and her inbox was flooded with messages of support from colleagues across different agencies. By noon, Sarah had filed official complaints with the Department of Transportation, the Federal Aviation Administration, and the airline's corporate office. Each complaint detailed the events with the precision expected of an FBI agent, times, quotes, and specific actions documented in clear, factual language. Agent Chen. A young analyst knocked at her temporary office door. There's something you should see. The analyst placed a tablet on Sarah's desk showing an aviation blog. The headline read, Pattern of Behavior? Multiple complaints surface against same flight attendant. The article detailed 3 previous incidents involving Rebecca Winters and passengers of color. In each case, complaints had been filed but apparently not acted upon. One incident from 8 months ago involved a South Asian doctor who was repeatedly ignored during drink service and then accused of being aggressive when he asked for water. This changes things, Sarah said quietly. Her phone rang. It was the airline's chief of human resources. Agent Chen, we're conducting an expedited investigation, the HR chief explained. Our preliminary findings are concerning. We've discovered Ms. Winters has had multiple complaints filed against her over the past 18 months. We're also reviewing her social media history, which contains some problematic content. Sarah listened carefully, taking notes. What happens next? We'd like you to participate in a formal interview tomorrow. Your perspective is critical to our investigation, the HR chief said. The videos provided by other passengers are compelling, but your first-hand account matters greatly. After the call, Sarah checked her personal email to find messages from 3 civil rights organizations offering support. The incident had clearly struck a nerve with many people. That evening, as Sarah prepared for the next day's interview, her supervisor called with an update. The airline's corporate security reached out to us formally, he explained. They placed Rebecca Winters on administrative leave pending investigation. But there's more. They're reviewing their entire training program and complaint system. Your case is already creating institutional change. Sarah sat back in her chair, processing this information. What had begun as a routine flight had become something much larger. As an FBI agent, she had faced dangerous criminals and high-pressure situations, with this different kind of courage. Standing up against everyday discrimination felt equally important. One more thing, her supervisor added. The Civil Rights Division is monitoring this case. They believe it might establish an important precedent for how airlines handle discriminatory incidents. As Sarah ended the call, she looked at the stack of passenger statements on her desk. Their support reminded her why this fight mattered. It wasn't just about one flight or one flight attendant. It was about ensuring equal treatment for everyone. 3 days after the incident, Sarah Chen sat across from a panel of airline executives in a large conference room at the Chicago headquarters. The atmosphere was tense but respectful as the airline's chief operating officer, Miranda Pavel, led the discussion. Agent Chen, first and foremost, on behalf of Skyline Airlines, I want to extend our sincere apologies for what happened on Flight 2437, Miranda began. What you experienced is completely unacceptable and contradicts our company values. Sarah nodded but remained professional. I appreciate that. My concern extends beyond my personal experience to how these situations impact all passengers. Miranda slid a folder across the table. Our investigation has been thorough. We've interviewed Ms. Winters, reviewed all available footage, and collected statements from 28 passengers and crew members. Sarah opened the folder to find a detailed report. As she scanned the first page, one paragraph stood out. Review of employee records indicates Ms. Winters has been the subject of 7 formal complaints in the past 24 months. 5 of these complaints specifically alleged discriminatory behavior toward passengers of Asian, Middle Eastern, or African American descent. Why wasn't action taken after the previous complaints? Sarah asked directly. The HR director, Thomas Reynolds, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Each complaint was handled individually by different managers. They were treated as customer service issues rather than potential discrimination. That was a serious failure in our system. But Ms. Winters did complete our required diversity training program last year, added the director of flight operations. Completing a training program doesn't guarantee changed behavior, Sarah replied, especially if there are no consequences for continuing the same patterns. The room fell silent for a moment. You're absolutely right, Miranda finally said. This has exposed significant gaps in our processes. She straightened in her chair. We've already begun implementing changes. Sarah listened as Miranda outlined their immediate actions. A complete review of all similar complaints from the past 3 years, revised reporting procedures that would flag potential discrimination patterns, and enhanced training that went beyond basic compliance. There's something else you should know, Thomas added. We've discovered concerning posts on Ms. Winters' personal social media accounts that show clear bias against several minority groups. He hesitated before continuing. Some posts specifically targeted Asian Americans using derogatory language and stereotypes. These were made during her employment with us and violate our code of conduct. Sarah maintained her composure despite feeling a cold wave of confirmation. The discrimination she'd experienced hadn't been imagined or exaggerated. It was part of a documented pattern. What happens now? She asked. The CEO has called for a company-wide video meeting tomorrow, Miranda explained. He plans to address this incident directly and announce our response. All 11,300 employees are required to attend, including flight crews who will view it during their layovers. As the meeting concluded, the airline's legal counsel approached Sarah privately. Agent Chen, we'd like to offer a settlement, she began cautiously. Sarah shook her head. I'm not interested in financial compensation. What I want is meaningful change and accountability. The lawyer nodded. The CEO anticipated you might say that. He's asked if you would consider consulting with us on improving our training programs instead. Sarah considered this unexpected offer. I need to check with my supervisors, but I might be open to that if I see real commitment to addressing the underlying issues. As Sarah left the airline headquarters, her phone buzzed with a news alert. Airline addresses viral discrimination incident, promises significant changes and appropriate action. That evening, Sarah received an encrypted email from within the airline. It contained a confidential memo outlining the agenda for tomorrow's company-wide meeting. The final items simply read: Personnel action regarding Flight 2437 incident. Live demonstration of zero tolerance policy. Reading between the lines, Sarah understood what was coming. The airline wasn't just going to apologize. They were planning to make an example of Rebecca Winters. At exactly 10:00 a.m. the next day, Skyline Airlines employees across the globe connected to the company-wide video meeting. In airport lounges, office buildings, and crew hotels, thousands of workers watched as CEO Richard Morrison appeared on their screens. "Good morning, everyone," Morrison began, his expression serious. "Today, we address an incident that has damaged our reputation and, more importantly, violated the trust of our customers." The CEO didn't mince words as he described what had happened on Flight 2437. He played selected clips from passenger videos showing Rebecca Winters' behavior towards Sarah Chen. "What you just witnessed is discrimination. Plain and simple," Morrison stated firmly. "It goes against everything Skyline Airlines claims to stand for." In a small conference room at the FBI Chicago field office, Sarah watched the broadcast alongside Assistant Director Jennings and two colleagues. She had been invited to view the meeting but had declined to participate directly. "He's not sugarcoating it," Jennings remarked. On screen, Morrison continued, "Our investigation revealed this was not an isolated incident. We found a pattern of similar behavior that went unaddressed due to failures in our reporting systems." He outlined the changes being implemented immediately: a new three-strike policy for discriminatory behavior, mandatory quarterly training for all customer-facing staff, and an independent review board to evaluate discrimination complaints. "But policies are meaningless without accountability," Morrison added, his tone growing even more serious. "Which brings me to the most difficult part of today's meeting." The camera angle widened to reveal a conference room where several executives sat at a long table. At the far end, looking nervous and defiant, sat Rebecca Winters. "Ms. Winters has been with Skyline for 7 years," Morrison said. "During that time, she has received multiple complaints regarding discriminatory treatment of passengers based on their race or ethnicity." Rebecca shifted uncomfortably in her seat as Morrison detailed the findings of their investigation, including her social media posts that violated company policy. "Usually, personnel matters are handled privately," the CEO explained. "But this situation demands transparent action. Our employees and customers need to see that we mean what we say about zero tolerance for discrimination." In the FBI conference room, Sarah leaned forward. This public approach was unexpected. On screen, Morrison turned to address Rebecca directly. "Ms. Winters, your actions on Flight 2437, combined with your history of similar behavior and your social media posts expressing prejudiced views, leave us no choice." Rebecca began to speak, but Morrison raised his hand. "We've reviewed your written statement and considered your perspective, but the evidence is overwhelming." He straightened his shoulders. "Effective immediately, your employment with Skyline Airlines is terminated." A collective gasp could be heard from employees watching in the same room as the CEO. Rebecca's face flushed red as security personnel appeared at the door. "Please surrender your company ID and credentials," Morrison instructed. "Security will escort you from the building." As Rebecca was led away, Morrison turned back to the camera. "Let this serve as clear evidence that discrimination will not be tolerated at any level of our organization. Not from new hires, not from veteran employees, not from anyone." In the FBI conference room, Sarah's colleagues looked at her with a mixture of satisfaction and respect. "That was intense," one agent commented. Sarah nodded, feeling conflicted. While she believed Rebecca deserved consequences, the public nature of the firing seemed designed partly as a publicity move to restore the airline's image. "What matters is whether this creates lasting change," she said quietly. As the meeting concluded, Morrison announced one final measure. "We've invited Agent Sarah Chen to help us redesign our diversity training program. She has shown remarkable professionalism throughout this ordeal, and we're grateful for her willingness to help us improve." Sarah's phone immediately lit up with messages from colleagues and friends who were watching. The public firing had already hit social media, with hashtag Skyline Accountability trending nationwide. For better or worse, what had begun as a personal experience of discrimination had become a very public statement about consequences. Sarah hoped it would make a difference beyond just this one case. 6 weeks after the viral incident, Sarah Chen stood before a group of 30 new Skyline Airlines flight attendants. The training room fell silent as she was introduced by Miranda Patel, the airline's COO. Agent Chen's experience has transformed our company, Miranda explained. Today, she'll share insights that will help you better serve all passengers, regardless of their background. Sarah nodded her thanks and looked across the eager faces. My story is just one example of how quickly things can go wrong when bias enters the picture, she began. But it's also a story about accountability and change. In the weeks following Rebecca Winter's public firing, Skyline Airlines had experienced both praise and criticism. Some applauded the decisive action, while others questioned whether terminating an employee on a live company broadcast crossed ethical lines. What no one could deny was that the airline had fully committed to addressing discrimination. Sarah had agreed to consult on their training program during her personal time. The FBI had approved this arrangement, seeing value in improving relations with a major airline while promoting civil rights. The most important lesson isn't about punishment, Sarah told the trainees. It's about creating an environment where every passenger feels respected and safe. After her presentation, Sarah returned to the FBI Chicago field office, where a small celebration awaited. Her colleagues had ordered a cake decorated with a miniature airplane and the words, "Justice at 30,000 feet." Very funny, Sarah said with a smile as Assistant Director Jennings handed her an envelope. This came for you today, he said, from the director himself. Inside was an official commendation praising her professionalism and courage. The Bureau was recognizing her not just for enduring discrimination, but for turning it into an opportunity for systemic change. That evening, Sarah checked her email to find a message from the businessman who had sat next to her on the flight. Agent Chen, I wanted you to know that I flew Skyline again yesterday. The difference was remarkable. The crew went out of their way to be respectful to everyone. Your stand has made a real impact. Thank you. Similar messages had arrived regularly since the incident. Sarah had become, somewhat reluctantly, a symbol of standing up against everyday discrimination. 2 days later, Sarah received an invitation to speak at a national transportation safety conference about recognizing and addressing bias in customer service. Though public speaking wasn't her favorite activity, she accepted, knowing her experience could help others. The airline had kept its promise about institutional changes. They had implemented a new reporting system that tracked potential discrimination patterns across all employees. Their revised training program now included realistic scenarios based partly on Sarah's experience. Most importantly, they had created an independent review board that included diversity experts from outside the company. On a personal level, Sarah had found unexpected closure in an unlikely place. During her consulting work, she learned that several of Rebecca's former colleagues had reached out to passengers who had filed previous complaints, offering sincere apologies that the airline had failed to address their concerns earlier. As Sarah prepared for her conference presentation, she reflected on the journey. What had begun as a humiliating experience had transformed into something positive. The incident hadn't changed the reality that discrimination existed, but it had demonstrated that accountability was possible. 3 months after the flight, Sarah received a final update from Skyline's CEO. Complaint rates for discriminatory behavior had dropped by 78%, and employee satisfaction scores were rising. The airline was now being studied as a case example of how to handle discrimination complaints effectively. That evening, as Sarah boarded another flight for a case assignment, she noticed something different. As the flight attendant checked her boarding pass, there was a moment of recognition in his eyes. "Thank you for flying with us, Agent Chen," he said with genuine respect. "And thank you for making air travel better for everyone." Sarah smiled and took her seat, knowing that sometimes justice comes not just from the courtroom, but from ordinary people refusing to accept mistreatment, and from institutions willing to truly change.